Picture a winter night in 1941 inside a map room, thick with smoke and certainty. Senior officers bent over Europe and the world as if they were solving a geometry problem. To them, the angles were simple. The United States might bluster, it might ship a trickle of material, but it would not, could not, fight a sustained war on two oceans at once, because a nation of merchants and motorists would never turn itself into a war machine before the clock ran out on Europe. And this conviction, quietly repeated in briefing after briefing, became the hidden assumption that shaped German planning at every level, from the way U-boats were deployed to the way reserves were rationed on the Eastern Front. The memory of 1917 distorted everything. American troops had arrived late, ships had been scarce, industry had required long lead times, and the German reading of that war hardened into doctrine. If the United States intervened again, the intervention would be slow, partial, and strategically clumsy. That reading ignored how radically the American economy and political culture had changed in the interwar years. When staff officers spoke of the United States, they spoke in clichés. A land of farmers and financiers, railways that moved wheat more than armor, assembly lines that made refrigerators and convertibles rather than cannon, a public too fond of comfort to tolerate rationing and casualty lists, and a Congress that would paralyze every decision with debate. In this portrait, a democracy looked indecisive by nature, and a consumer economy looked brittle the moment luxury turned to necessity. Geography seemed to make the case airtight. Everything America needed for a European war had to cross the Atlantic. Everything it needed for a Pacific war had to cross a different, longer ocean. A navy could not be in two places at once. Merchant shipping could not be conjured from thin air. And even if the United States built ships at unprecedented speed, the U-boats would harvest them faster than they sailed. The very map seduced the mind: too vast blue distances, too many miles, not enough time. That picture hardened after early Allied missteps in 1942. The convoy system still uneven, radar and long-range patrols not yet dominant, escorts in short supply, and German submarines enjoying their happy time off the American coast. German analysts mistook a transitional phase for destiny and reported to their superiors that American logistics would remain tangled indefinitely, that port throughput in Britain had a hard ceiling, that the rails to the docks would bottleneck, and that troop convoys could be throttled in mid-ocean once the U-boat arm concentrated. The conclusion followed. America might arm Britain or mount limited raids, but a full-scale continental offensive while simultaneously fighting Japan was fantasy. Beneath the shipping arithmetic sat a cultural judgment that went largely unchallenged in German headquarters. Americans were energetic improvisers, but not disciplined soldiers. As a society, they were rich in gadgets and poor in staying power. Their factories could produce quality consumer goods, but war demanded exacting metallurgy, heavy machine tools, and a workforce trained to tolerances learned through apprenticeship, not weekend shifts. That belief rested on a German preference for craftsmanship and a misunderstanding of what mass production at scale could do once quality control, interchangeable parts, and standardized designs replaced artisanal pride as the organizing principle of output. The misreading extended to manpower and training. German officers assumed that a volunteer society would balk at conscription, that a diverse, individualistic culture would resist military discipline, and that officers promoted from civilian life would lack the instincts honed by professional academies. Early American field performance at Kasserine seemed to confirm the prejudiced green units breaking under pressure, supply discipline uneven, inter-service rivalry obvious. But the lesson drawn was mistaken, because it measured capability at a moment rather than as a trajectory, and it ignored the American habit of institutional learning at scale. The brutal speed with which a decentralized system could incorporate feedback, rewrite manuals, rebuild organizations, and replace failed equipment with better versions without waiting for a single general's signature. The two-front problem looked even worse to German eyes when Japan entered the war. Suddenly, they told themselves, America would be forced to split steel, fuel, hulls, aircraft, and attention, and the Pacific, emotionally charged by the shock of Pearl Harbor, would naturally capture priority. In Berlin's calculus, that meant Europe would receive leftovers, strategically, industrially, and psychologically. They spoke confidently about divided focus, assuming that the U.S. Navy and Army would compete rather than coordinate, that the Marine Corps would drain amphibious resources, and that the aircraft industry would be forced into mutually exclusive choices between carrier planes and heavy bombers. Their charts assumed zero-sum trade-offs, where the American system was built to grow the pie. Intelligence summaries baked these beliefs into numbers. Tonnage tables circulated in late 1941 and early 1942 counted hulls on the water as if those figures could not change dramatically in 12 months, counted aircraft plants as if retooling were metaphysics rather than management, and counted labor as if only unionized male factory hands existed. The possibility that women would flood the industrial workforce, that entire regions would be mobilized by new plants erected on empty fields, that universities and corporations would braid themselves into research consortia, turning laboratories into production lines. All of that sat outside German models, not because they lacked data, but because they lacked a conceptual frame to imagine flexible scale. When they looked at American finance, they saw debt ceilings and tax politics. They did not see a political system that, under shock, could align treasury, industry, and labor in months. In their view, elections would paralyze strategy. Midterms would bite. State governors would obstruct, and public opinion would sour at the first sign of setbacks. German planners treated democracy as a constraint in war, never as a force multiplier that legitimized sacrifice and unlocked voluntary compliance at a scale authoritarian edict could not match. Even their reading of Britain and the Soviet Union, America's principal partners, reinforced the misconception. Britain, they believed, was nearing exhaustion, its manpower stretched and its currency strained. The USSR, they insisted, would collapse under attrition before American aid could matter. And so, Lend-Lease was shrugged off as propaganda, a trickle of trucks and canned meat that would not change outcomes at the front. The reality that American material could keep Britain fighting while the United States built its own armies, that American locomotives, rails, bearings, and food could unburden Soviet industry for wartime priorities, was not believed because it clashed with the earlier conclusion that American production could not surge fast enough to be decisive on any timeline that mattered. A shorter war favored Germany. Therefore, shorter war was what they planned for, and any scenario that required them to withstand a flood in 1943-44 was treated as hypothetical rather than likely. This is how assumptions become traps. The distance argument. Those two oceans also hit a second mistake. It extrapolated from fixed capacity instead of dynamic adaptation. German briefings treated port limits in Britain as immutable, ignoring civil military engineering that would expand harbors, dredge channels, and unload cargo faster with new cranes and mechanized handling. They assumed the convoy escort gap in the mid-Atlantic was permanent, not a temporary consequence of aircraft range and production lags. They counted U-boat kills while discounting countermeasures arriving in waves, new escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, centimetric radar, high-frequency direction finding, better depth charges, improved training and tactics. They would convert the Atlantic from hunting ground to guarded highway. In other words, they forecast the future by extending the present, and the present in early 1942 was misleading by design, because America was still turning the keys on factories not yet built. The cultural caricature did its own damage. In German staff rooms, the United States was explained with jokes about Coca-Cola at the front and ice cream machines on ships, so comfort became a synonym for softness. But comfort in American practice was logistics with a morale purpose. Hot food, medical care, and leave rotations kept units effective without romanticizing hardship, and a system that valued the soldiers' well-being built depth because volunteers kept coming and veterans cycled back to training commands that multiplied their experience. The German lens treated such measures as signs of decadence. The American lens treated them as investments with compound interest. Another blind spot sat in technology management. German officers admired feats of engineering and individual brilliance, and they read American gadgetry as scattered and wasteful. They did not see the less glamorous miracle program management linking university labs, private firms, and government agencies into pipelines that could take a concept from trial to standardized kit in months. This was not the cult of the one perfect machine, but the discipline of good enough, everywhere, now, which is exactly how you supply two wars at once. The German habit of incremental perfection was formidable in a workshop and brittle in a global supply chain under air attack, while the American habit of modularity and interchangeability was inelegant on paper and unstoppable at sea. Even when evidence began to contradict the old picture, the human tendency to confirm priors kept the misconception alive. Early Pacific victories for the U.S. Navy were discounted as naval chess, far from the main theater, while North African setbacks were magnified as the true American character. Reports from the field that American trucks and radios were abundant, that airfields were sprouting in weeks, that depots groaned with spares. These were attributed to British stockpiles or raiding luck. When Lend-Lease columns started arriving in the USSR in growing numbers, German officers dismissed them as statistical anomalies or propaganda figures inflated for morale. The pattern is clear. If the model says a thing cannot happen, field reports that it is happening are treated as exceptions rather than updates. Time preference finished the trap. The German high command needed the war to be short in order to win, so every assumption was bent toward a short war logic. Supply constraints would cap American effort, political constraints would limit casualty tolerance, geographic constraints would slow mass to a trickle. These premises justified risk in 1942 and 1943 because they suggested a window existed before American power reached cruising speed. Once that window closed, the premises did not get retired. They hardened into grievances about fate. Consider how this thinking distorted strategic choices. The submarine campaign was expected to keep the Atlantic in crisis indefinitely, so investment in the U-boat arm looked like a guarantor of European breathing room. But that meant diverting resources from air defenses and from standardized truck production the Army desperately needed. Belief in Soviet collapse meant that equipment and fuel were bled east, at rates a two-front war could not sustain. Faith that America could not coordinate a Pacific European effort led to complacency about amphibious capacity in the West, only for German units to confront later a set of Allied capabilities: mass landing craft, amphibious trucks, floating causeways, and a tempo of supply that made rivers and coastlines feel like potholes instead of moats that no one in the early years had truly priced in. There was also a moral misread, and it mattered. German officers looked at American domestic politics and saw argument everywhere. Congressional hearings, newspaper editorials, union negotiations, presidential press conferences, and they mistook argument for paralysis. They did not grasp how argument inside a constitutional system can produce consent, and how consent underwrites endurance. Once a democratic public decided the war had to be won, it accepted rationing, bond drives, longer hours, and the mobilization of women and new workers into roles tradition had not assigned to them. The German model predicted fragmentation where cohesion formed. Intelligence failures compounded cultural bias. Estimates of American steel, aluminum, and aviation fuel output lagged reality because they were compiled from pre-war baselines and commercial publications, not from wartime signals orders to machine tool makers, power grid expansions, rail car manufacturing spikes, new refinery construction, whose pattern was visible but unrecognized as a unified mobilization. Analysts tabulated ships laid down without revising build times for modular assembly, counted aircraft engines without counting subcontracted parts, and ignored the multiplicative effect of standardization that allowed parts to be swapped from factory to factory when bottlenecks appeared. The result was a year-to-year lag in German awareness, so that by the time a 1942 estimate reached a general's desk, it described 1941. And by the time he made a plan for 1943, it relied on a picture of 1942 that no longer existed. The belief that the Pacific would drain American strength also misread American identity. Pearl Harbor did not split attention away from Europe so much as it unified purpose across both theaters, and institutions were built to reflect that: boards that allocated resources across services, shipping controls that routed hulls with a whole war logic, joint planning staffs that synchronized calendars. The German expectation of bureaucratic competition and petty turf fights kept the model anchored in the idea that every bomber built for Europe meant one fewer carrier plane for the Pacific. The American solution was to grow both lines at once by adding plants and shifts, not by robbing Peter to pay Paul. When officers briefed Hitler on American intentions, they often reassured him that Washington would prefer the war's comforts, the distant blockade, the air campaign, the subsidizing of allies, to the costly decision to land major armies in Europe while also rolling back Japan. That reassurance mattered because it allowed riskier gambles elsewhere, but at the root sat the same error: an inability to imagine an industrial democracy that could change gear ratios quickly, scale production beyond historical reference, and accept the tax and debt burdens such a program required. The mental model did not break even when the evidence piled high, because to admit the scale of American mobilization was to admit that time was the enemy. The miscalculation had a human face at company and battalion level. German officers arriving at the front in late 1942 and early 1943 expected American units to be lavishly equipped but tactically naive, well supplied but brittle. They anticipated breakdowns after initial assaults, confused coordination between armor and air, and an allergy to night fighting. When those weaknesses appeared, they confirmed the stereotype. When those weaknesses diminished, as they did with training cycles, better radios, and doctrine that emphasized combined arms, the stereotype survived by insisting the Americans could not possibly sustain competence on two distant fronts at once. And so, even as reports arrived of multiple simultaneous operations, Pacific Island campaigns accelerating while North Africa bled into Sicily and Italy. The narrative in headquarters framed each success as a temporary overreach that would force a pause. By the time it became undeniable that there would be no pause, the army and the nation that had bet on a short war were trapped in a long one, shaped by the very industrial tide they had declared impossible. The most revealing tell in the misconception was what German planners did not plan for. They did not write serious contingencies for an enemy that could land in force in the West while keeping an air and sea offensive humming in the Pacific. They did not conceive of logistics so friction-light that destroyed bridges or mined harbors could be worked around with floating infrastructure. They did not steel themselves for a partner system in which Britain's maritime experience and America's output integrated seamlessly. And they did not imagine the psychological effect on their own troops of facing an opponent for whom ammunition, fuel, and spare parts seemed inexhaustible. Men fight differently when they believe the next crate will arrive, and the German model insisted those crates would stop. In the end, the belief that the United States could not supply two fronts at once was not a single error, but a stack of them. History misread as prophecy, geography treated as fate, culture reduced to caricature, data gathered without a theory of scale, and time discounted as if the enemy could not learn, each layer reinforcing the next until the facade looked like granite. It was, in the stark language of strategy, a failure of imagination, and it set the stage for the shock that followed when the factories roared, the convoys thickened, the training pipelines matured, and the reality that had been dismissed as fantasy began to arrive by the shipload. When the United States shifted to a war footing after 1941, the pace and scale of transformation were unlike anything the world had seen. In months, industries that had once sold cars, radios, and household appliances became arsenals producing tanks, bombers, rifles, and shells. German generals, steeped in a tradition of incremental production and artisanal engineering, could not grasp how quickly a civilian economy of mass consumption could reconfigure itself into a military powerhouse. The surprise was not in isolated feats but in the systemic surge, the way entire sectors pivoted in concert. Detroit, once the capital of automobiles, became a war machine capital. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler converted their assembly lines from sedans and convertibles to Sherman tanks, B-24 bombers, and military trucks. Assembly methods already perfected for consumer goods were repurposed for military needs, multiplying throughput beyond any European precedent. Factories that once turned out a few thousand cars a month were now delivering thousands of military vehicles on the same timetable. The numbers staggered even America's allies. By 1943, American shipyards were producing Liberty cargo vessels at a pace that defied belief, one completed every single day, sometimes launched in less than 2 weeks from keel laying to delivery. German intelligence dismissed such reports as exaggeration until convoys of Liberty ships stretched across the Atlantic in undeniable mass. Aircraft production told the same story. In 1939, the U.S. had fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1944, the figure exceeded 96,000 produced in a single year, including long-range bombers, fighters, and transports. Willow Run, the giant Ford plant in Michigan, rolled out a B-24 Liberator every hour at peak capacity. To German officers raised in a culture where handcraft and specialization limited production runs, this was inconceivable. They could not imagine a society where interchangeable parts and assembly line discipline made such rates routine. Steel and aluminum output scaled in parallel. The United States produced more steel than Germany and Japan combined, and its aluminum capacity expanded eightfold between 1939 and 1943, feeding the bomber plants and shipyards without visible constraint. Rubber, once a critical bottleneck, was solved by synthetic production. Another pivot Germans failed to anticipate. Where the Axis scrambled for natural resources, the Americans innovated substitutes, stabilizing supply with chemistry and scale. At the same time, agricultural productivity ensured that food never became a limiting factor. Mechanized farms, fertilizers, and transport networks delivered surpluses that fed not only U.S. forces, but also allies dependent on imports. Millions of tons of canned meat, grains, and powdered milk crossed the oceans, sustaining armies and civilians alike. This was industry understood broadly, not only weapons, but the systems of life support that kept soldiers fighting. What astonished observers was not simply the quantity, but the simultaneity. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, ships, small arms, ammunition, uniforms, food, and fuel were all scaling together, not one at the expense of another. German planners assumed trade-offs. More aircraft meant fewer tanks, more ships meant fewer guns. The American system, powered by continental resources and coordinated through the War Production Board, grew every category at once. By 1944, American industry was producing more war material than all Axis powers combined, while still maintaining a standard of civilian life that would have been considered luxurious in wartime Europe. The phrase, "arsenal of democracy," was not propaganda. It was description. Consider automobiles again. In 1941, civilian car production stopped. By 1942, those factories were turning out Jeeps by the hundreds of thousands, vital for mobility across every theater. The Willys Jeep became an icon not just for its design, but for its sheer ubiquity. German officers encountering them on multiple fronts wondered how such a small vehicle could be everywhere. The answer was industrial repetition. American plants produced over 600,000 Jeeps during the war, more than enough to saturate armies and supply chains. Likewise, truck production reached into the millions. The U.S. delivered over 2 million trucks of all types vehicles that moved armies at a pace no European system could match. German units, short on transport, often relied on horses well into 1944. The contrast could not have been sharper: motorized mobility on one side, logistical drag on the other. The shipbuilding miracle carried similar weight. Beyond Liberty ships came the faster Victory ships and a flood of escort vessels, destroyer escorts, landing ships, tank carriers, each produced in standardized designs that cut time and cost. At Kaiser shipyards, workers with no previous maritime experience assembled vessels in record time. Prefabricated sections, welded rather than riveted, made assembly almost modular. Launch ceremonies became routine events, as if warships were consumer goods rolling off a line. For Germany, struggling to replace U-boats and capital ships under constant bombardment, this pace was unimaginable. Aircraft carriers illustrate the asymmetry even more clearly. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. launched over 120 carriers of various classes, from massive fleet carriers to escort types. These floating airfields allowed the United States to project power across both oceans, sustaining operations in Europe and the Pacific without choosing between them. German naval doctrine had no counterpart. Its few large warships were prestige units rather than scalable platforms. Aircraft production added another layer of shock. Fighters like the P-51 Mustang, bombers like the B-17 and B-29, and transports like the C-47 were built in numbers that dwarfed Axis totals. By the end of the war, U.S. factories had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft. Each new theater, North Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific Islands, was supplied with fresh squadrons as if air power grew without limit. German pilots, outnumbered in the skies, described wave after wave of American aircraft, never seeming to dwindle. Behind those waves stood not chance, but industry. Fuel completed the picture. American oil production provided the sinews of mobility, gasoline for vehicles, aviation fuel for aircraft, diesel for ships. Refineries on the Gulf Coast and in California poured out millions of barrels monthly. Even synthetic fuel plants in Germany could not come close. In this domain, America's natural resources combined with industrial scale to erase scarcity from the war effort. The magnitude of this output meant that the United States could not only equip its own forces, but also sustain allies. Britain received aircraft, destroyers, and trucks that kept it in the fight after 1940. The Soviet Union received locomotives, rails, vehicles, and food that allowed its factories to focus on tanks and guns. China received supplies that kept its armies resisting Japan. To German eyes, this was not merely rearmament, it was something alien, a kind of industrial overproduction so great it spilled beyond borders. They had no framework to interpret such abundance. To them, every economy had natural ceilings. America had none. What made this acceleration possible was coordination. The War Production Board set priorities, assigned raw materials, and prevented bottlenecks. Industrialists like Henry Kaiser, William Knudsen, and Charles Sorensen turned private sector skills into public power. Labor unions agreed to no-strike pledges. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling the assembly lines with skill and speed. Immigrant communities added their labor to the surge. It was not just technology but organization, the harnessing of a continent into a single war project. German officers, trained in a centralized state, expected bureaucratic friction to slow a democracy. Instead, the decentralized system proved more adaptive. Competition between firms drove efficiency. Government contracts rewarded speed. Mistakes were corrected in weeks, not years. Failures became prototypes for improvements. The scale of learning matched the scale of production. Even the timeline astonished. The DUKW amphibious truck went from concept to prototype in just 38 days, and over 21 were built by war's end. Radar sets, proximity fuses, and long-range bombers followed similar arcs. Ideas accelerated to deployment at speeds German research institutes could not match. German generals, used to boutique designs like the Tiger tank, underestimated what standardized mass could achieve. For every Tiger, America could build dozens of Shermans less powerful individually, but overwhelming collectively. By 1944, those Shermans rolled off ships in waves, their spare parts interchangeable, their maintenance simple, their numbers endless. The philosophy was clear. Quantity had a quality of its own. That philosophy, executed with relentless consistency, made the two fronts at once problem vanish. The United States did not choose between Europe and the Pacific. It scaled to meet both. It built carriers and bombers simultaneously, armored divisions and island-hopping marines simultaneously, convoys to Britain and supplies to China simultaneously. For German planners, schooled in scarcity, this was not war as they understood it. It was industry as war, and industry at American scale. By 1944, the disparity was visible everywhere. On the beaches of Normandy, American units landed with tanks, trucks, bulldozers, radios, rations, and ammunition in volumes that made logistics look effortless. In the Pacific, carrier groups operated as floating cities, resupplied at sea by oilers and supply ships, a mobile industrial base projecting power across thousands of miles. The same nation that built the Manhattan Project in secret also launched cargo ships like factory products. German generals, trapped in bombed-out plants struggling for steel and coal, looked at these phenomena and saw not just enemies, but impossibilities. The disbelief was real. Even in captured diaries and interrogations, how could one nation sustain this torrent? The answer lay in scale, in systems, in a national decision that production itself was the decisive weapon. This was the arsenal of democracy in action, factories as regiments, shipyards as divisions, assembly lines as fronts. And once it was in motion, nothing Germany did could stop it. The industrial surge that stunned German generals was not confined to equipping American troops. It extended outward through the arteries of global logistics, supplying entire nations with the means to fight. This was the essence of Lend-Lease, a program that rewrote the logic of alliance warfare. To the German high command, the notion that the United States could arm itself while simultaneously sustaining Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and smaller partners seemed absurd. They assumed supply was a zero-sum game. If America sent tanks to Moscow, it would have fewer for its own armies. If it shipped food to Britain, its own soldiers would feel the shortage. What they did not understand was that American industry had been built precisely to overproduce, to saturate markets, and that once retooled for war, that same overproduction became a strategic weapon. The figures tell the story. By the end of the program, the United States had shipped to its allies nearly 50,000 tanks, over 400,000 trucks, more than 14,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of food and raw materials. To the Soviets went Sherman tanks and Valentine tanks, Cobra fighters, locomotives, rails, and the legendary Studebaker trucks that hauled Katyusha rocket launchers across muddy steppes. To Britain went destroyers, aircraft, radar equipment, and cargo ships that kept the island nation alive under U-boat assault. To China went rifles, artillery, and supplies that kept resistance alive against Japan. The scale of generosity was not charity, it was strategy, and it defied every German assumption about what was possible. German intelligence reports often mentioned the arrival of American equipment in the Soviet Union, but they consistently underestimated its volume and impact. They considered the Soviet war effort self-contained, failing to appreciate how American trucks freed Soviet factories to build tanks, how American food freed manpower for the front, and how American rails and locomotives repaired the Red Army's battered transport network. At Stalingrad, Kursk, and the great offensives of 1943 and 1944, Soviet mobility was powered in no small part by Studebaker engines and American gasoline. Yet to German officers, the myth of a collapsing Soviet system blinded them. They believed the Red Army could not have rebuilt its strength so quickly on its own, but they could not accept that the missing piece was American industrial support flowing by Arctic convoy, Persian Gulf routes, and the Pacific. The British case was just as decisive. In 1940, Britain stood alone, its merchant fleet bleeding under submarine attack, its industrial base strained by bombing. German strategists assumed the island would be starved into compromise. What they failed to see was the backstop of Lend-Lease. Liberty ships delivered grain, fuel, and aircraft. Replacement destroyers patrolled the Atlantic. By the time Germany expected Britain to crack, American supply had stiffened it into endurance. This meant that German strategy of blockade, perfected in theory, collapsed in practice because a transatlantic pipeline of ships and cargoes made the island unconquerable by starvation. German disbelief grew sharper when evidence showed America was not merely giving scraps but major weapons. Sherman tanks fought under British and Soviet flags. Cobras, often dismissed by American pilots as second-rate, proved deadly in Soviet hands, especially at low altitude. Britain's Desert Air Force flew American-built P-40s against Rommel. German soldiers on every front began encountering American hardware not only in U.S. units, but in enemy formations wearing different uniforms. This created a psychological effect. The enemy seemed endlessly supplied, as if every destroyed tank or aircraft could be replaced overnight. That impression was not far from reality. Food supplies deserve special attention. Millions of tons of wheat, corn, meat, and powdered milk moved across oceans to feed not only armies but civilian populations under siege. To the Soviet Union alone went over 4.5 million tons of foodstuffs, enough to sustain millions of soldiers in the field. Canned meat, spam, powdered eggs, and milk became staples in Soviet rations. German soldiers captured Soviet supply dumps and found American labels on the crates, a revelation that contradicted their belief in Soviet self-sufficiency. For Germany, struggling to feed its own population under blockade, the sight was demoralizing. Lend-Lease was not only about weapons, but about sustaining the will to fight. German officers could not comprehend the efficiency of America's global shipping system, which moved resources outward while sustaining its own expanding armies. They expected bottlenecks, shortages, and trade-offs. Instead, they confronted an adversary who could pour supplies into multiple funnels at once. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk defied weather and U-boats. The Persian corridor built railways and pipelines through Iran to reach the Soviet Union. The Pacific route ferried goods through Vladivostok under delicate diplomatic arrangements. Each route required coordination across oceans, allies, and cultures. Each succeeded. German planners never anticipated such reach. They assumed that distance was a weapon in their favor. America turned distance into logistics practice. The impact on Allied strategy was transformative. Britain could concentrate its resources on building specialized equipment, radar, code-breaking, advanced aircraft while relying on American mass for basics. The Soviet Union could hurl men and tanks at the front without starving its railways or armies of vehicles, because American trucks, locomotives, and boots filled the gaps. China, battered and fragmented, continued resisting Japan, in part because U.S. airlifts and supply routes provided a lifeline. These realities meant Germany was not facing one enemy, but many enemies, each magnified by American supply. What appeared on the battlefield as Soviet tenacity or British resilience often contained an American industrial fingerprint. German officers interrogated after the war spoke of their shock at learning the true volumes. One described it as fighting three Americas at once, one in U.S. uniform, one in Soviet uniform, and one in British. That perception captures the essence of Lend-Lease. It multiplied America's presence beyond its own armies. It weaponized surplus. It made alliances additive in a way Germany could not match. Germany's own attempts at economic coordination with its allies never achieved such integration. Italy and Japan could not pool resources effectively. German industry struggled to supply even its own forces under bombing and blockade. The idea of sending thousands of tanks or millions of tons of food abroad was unimaginable. Thus, German officers judged by their own standards. If they could not do it, America could not either. This assumption collapsed under the weight of Liberty ships unloading cargoes in ports across the globe. What made Lend-Lease so devastating to German strategy was its invisibility at first. On the battlefield, an American tank under a British commander looked like British power. A Soviet rocket launcher mounted on a studebaker looked like Soviet industry. Food and Soviet rations looked like Soviet supply. German intelligence failed to peel back the layers and see the American origin. Only when captured documents and Allied disclosures revealed the truth did the scale sink in. By then it was too late. The psychological dimension of Lend-Lease cannot be ignored. For German soldiers, encountering American equipment in enemy hands eroded the sense that the war could be won by attrition. No matter how many tanks were destroyed, more seemed to appear. No matter how many convoys were sunk, new ones arrived. The perception of inexhaustibility was as damaging as the reality because it made resistance feel futile. When combined with the simultaneous buildup of American armies preparing for their own offensives, the effect was overwhelming. To Germany, the United States was not merely another combatant, it was an industrial giant underwriting an entire coalition. That was the true shock of Lend-Lease. It revealed that America's factories were not producing for one nation's needs, but for the needs of a global alliance. And for a German command rooted in the belief that America could not even supply itself on two fronts, the sight of American weapons, trucks, and food sustaining multiple allies was a revelation too late to change the course of the war. Logistics is where wars are truly won or lost, and in the Second World War, no country mastered the science of supply as thoroughly as the United States. German generals who had underestimated American industry were equally blind to the scale of the transport network that carried those weapons, vehicles, and provisions across oceans, rivers, and continents. They thought of production and delivery as separate problems, with bottlenecks guaranteed to slow any arsenal. In reality, American planners understood that production without transport was meaningless, and so they built the largest logistical apparatus in human history, one capable of sustaining multiple allies while feeding and equipping their own armies on two opposite sides of the globe. To the Wehrmacht, the sheer scope of this system was unimaginable until it broke through every defensive line and rendered every blockade ineffective. The heart of the system was shipping. In 1939, the United States had a modest merchant fleet, but once war began, shipyards exploded in number and capacity. Henry Kaiser's yards on the West Coast pioneered prefabricated construction, welding sections together like giant toy blocks. The result was the Liberty ship, a standardized cargo vessel designed for one thing: to be built faster than the enemy could sink it. At peak output, one was launched every day. Some were completed in as little as 5 days from keel laying to launch, a pace that stunned even American observers. These ships carried everything: tanks, trucks, food, fuel, ammunition, and each launch was a direct counter to the German U-boat campaign. German admirals assumed tonnage lost would exceed tonnage built. By 1943, that assumption collapsed. Production outpaced losses, and convoys began to grow thicker, better protected, and unstoppable. Victory ships followed, faster and longer-lived, carrying the flow deep into 1945. Alongside them came entire classes of specialized vessels: landing ship tanks, LSTs, landing craft infantry, LCIs, destroyer escorts, and escort carriers. Each was mass-produced, each part of a system designed not for elegance, but for scale. A Liberty ship might not match a German vessel in craftsmanship, but in war quantity was the decisive metric. By war's end, the United States had built over 2,700 Liberty ships and more than 500 Victory ships. No blockade could withstand that river of steel. But ships alone were not enough. Cargo had to move safely across hostile seas. The convoy system, perfected in partnership with Britain, turned the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a guarded highway. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of merchant ships traveled together, shielded by destroyers, corvettes, and escort carriers. Long-range patrol aircraft filled the infamous mid-Atlantic gap, where U-boats had once attacked with impunity. Radar, sonar, depth charges, and the cracking of German codes at Bletchley Park steadily shifted the balance. Losses remained painful, but the overall flow grew heavier each month. German commanders expected Britain to starve. Instead, by 1943, Britain was receiving more food, fuel, and weapons than ever before, all under the cover of convoys too thick to be stopped. Supplying the Soviet Union required even greater ingenuity. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Archangel braved ice storms and Luftwaffe attack. Crews endured freezing seas and constant danger, but the cargo got through: tanks, trucks, locomotives, planes, food, and raw materials that fed directly into the Soviet war machine. When the northern routes grew too dangerous, the Persian Corridor was developed. American engineers built railways, roads, and pipelines through Iran to deliver supplies north. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of trucks and millions of tons of cargo moved along routes that had scarcely existed before 1941. In the Pacific, supplies flowed into Vladivostok under delicate arrangements that skirted Japanese interference. Multiple routes, each a feat of engineering and coordination, ensured that even geography's harshest obstacles could not cut the arteries of supply. On land, railroads formed the backbone. Inside the United States, a continent-sized transport grid carried the output of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago to Atlantic and Pacific ports. Trains loaded with tanks, aircraft, and ammunition rumbled in endless succession, their schedules coordinated with ships waiting at the docks. Specialized depots staged cargo, ensuring that ships were loaded efficiently and without delay. Nothing was left to improvisation. Every hour of rail and dock time was maximized. The result was that American production did not pile up uselessly inland. It flowed seamlessly to where it was needed. Once abroad, railways built or repaired by American engineers carried supplies further. In Iran, new tracks stretched toward the Soviet border. In France, after D-Day, rail units rebuilt lines destroyed by retreating Germans. Locomotives shipped under Lend-Lease powered them, along with American-built railcars. Every link of the chain reinforced the others. German officers who depended on horse-drawn wagons on the Eastern Front could not comprehend how entire armies could be fed, fueled, and armed by a machine that seemed to move at the speed of industry itself. Trucks then extended the chain forward. In Europe, the Red Ball Express became legendary, a non-stop convoy of thousands of trucks supplying advancing Allied armies after the breakout from Normandy. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, kept the wheels turning day and night, hauling fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts from the beaches to the front lines. At peak, nearly 6,000 vehicles were on the road at once, delivering 2,500 tons of supplies every day. Without it, the advance across France would have stalled. For the Soviet Union, Studebaker trucks carried everything from artillery to Katyusha rocket launchers, often slogging through mud that would have swallowed horses and carts. Millions of American-built trucks gave the Red Army its mobility, allowing it to outmaneuver the Wehrmacht on the very terrain where Germans once held the advantage. Even rivers, once considered natural barriers, were neutralized by American logistics. Amphibious vehicles like the DUKW could ferry supplies across water obstacles without waiting for engineers to build bridges. Bridging equipment, mass-produced and shipped forward, allowed combat engineers to span rivers in days where German doctrine assumed weeks. Portable Bailey bridges, invented by the British but mass-produced in American factories, turned rivers into minor inconveniences. The Rhine, Germany's last great natural defense, fell not only because of firepower, but because Allied logistics could cross water as easily as land. To the Wehrmacht, which had spent years preparing defenses along rivers, this was a revelation too late to matter. Fuel required its own innovations. Operation Pluto pipelines under the ocean carried gasoline from Britain to Normandy under the English Channel. On the continent, American engineers laid pipelines behind advancing armies, turning fuel delivery into a continuous flow rather than a convoy risk. Tankers filled with aviation fuel kept airfields supplied at a tempo that sustained round-the-clock bombing campaigns. At sea, entire fleets of oilers enabled carrier task forces to refuel in the middle of the Pacific, extending operations across thousands of miles. German admirals could not believe that entire naval groups could live off floating infrastructure, but American ships carried their own ports with them. Logistics itself became mobile. Air transport added yet another dimension. The C-47 Skytrain, the workhorse transport aircraft, flew cargo and paratroopers alike. Over the hump, the Himalayas, American pilots ferried fuel and supplies to China in one of the most dangerous airlifts ever attempted. Losses were high, but the flow never stopped. In Europe, air transport moved spare parts, medical supplies, and reinforcements faster than any ground route. For evacuating wounded soldiers, aircraft shortened survival times dramatically. Supply by air was expensive in resources, but America's scale made it viable. German forces, struggling to resupply even small pockets like Stalingrad by air, could not grasp how the Allies used air transport as a routine supplement to land and sea. Ports were transformed into engines of supply. At Normandy, the Mulberry Harbor's floating docks and breakwaters towed across the channel created instant ports where none existed. American engineers and Seabees built and repaired docks at record speed, sometimes under fire, ensuring that cargoes flowed ashore even when permanent ports were damaged. Warehouses, depots, and fuel storage facilities multiplied behind the front lines. The logistical tail was long, but it was strong, and it reached wherever it was needed. German commanders assumed that lack of port capacity would choke any invasion. The mulberries proved them wrong. Even when storms destroyed one harbor, the other kept working until Cherbourg and Antwerp could be captured and restored. Behind all of this stood people. Merchant mariners braved U-boat-infested waters, dock workers loaded and unloaded ships in shifts that never ended, engineers laid track, built depots, and spanned rivers. Truck drivers pushed through exhaustion on roads choked with dust and mud. Navy crews refueled carriers at sea, sometimes within sight of enemy planes. It was not glamorous, but it was decisive. The American system did not rely on miracle weapons. It relied on ordinary men and women performing extraordinary tasks within an organized framework. That was the true weapon of logistics: scale plus coordination. The psychological impact was immense. German troops fought hungry, short of fuel, and with limited ammunition. Allied troops received hot food, mail from home, and seemingly endless supplies of bullets and shells. This contrast shaped morale as much as combat. Soldiers who trusted their logistics fought longer and harder. Soldiers who felt abandoned lost faith. German generals could not calculate this factor, but it weighed heavily on the battlefield. In the final analysis, the American logistical system made the impossible routine. It allowed the United States to fight in Europe and the Pacific at the same time, to arm allies while expanding its own armies, to project power across oceans as if they were rivers. The Wehrmacht never solved the puzzle because it never believed the puzzle had a solution. They imagined distance and scarcity as immutable laws. America turned them into problems of engineering and management and then solved them. This was the silent victory, the triumph not of generals on battlefields, but of planners, builders, and transport crews who turned industry into movement. Without it, factories would have piled up with unused weapons, ships would have waited idle, and armies would have starved. With it, production became power, and power became victory. German commanders who dismissed logistics as secondary learned too late that it was the central front of the war. If you've made it this far, you've seen how supply lines, ships, trains, trucks, and pipelines shape the outcome as much as tanks and planes. Here's the question I want to throw to you. If you had to choose one single element as the most decisive Liberty ships, the Red Ball Express or Pluto pipelines, what would it be? Drop your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden gears of history.